Welcome to Healthy Living, your health awareness show on Afro Worldview, the show that keeps you informed with all your health-related matters. My name is Ronald Avidji, and today we focus on hypertension. Let's take a look at what we've got in store for you. We speak to cardiologist Dr. Tsabedze, dietitian Tony Bryan, and we kick the winter blues with some exercise. The theme for World Hypertension Day is Know Your Numbers, with the goal of increasing high blood pressure awareness in all populations around the world. Hypertension is a silent killer. It's a medical condition that often remains undiagnosed until relatively late in its course. It affects 1 billion people worldwide. The condition can be explained as blood pressure levels exceeding the measurement of 140/90, and about 90% of hypertension cases have no cause and are triggered by a host of factors, including a genetic predisposition, high stress levels, poor dietary habits, and being obese, and a few other health concerns. To find out more about hypertension, we went to visit the Charlotte Maxeke Academic Hospital to chat to cardiologist Dr. Tsabedze. Here's what he had to say. Doctor, thank you so much for your time in joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Knowing that the focus for the next while is about hypertension, we know it's a heart condition, but if you could define what hypertension is, what would you say?
Basically, it's a condition, a very silent disease, where patients who present or who have the courage to get screened or get their blood pressure measured are found to have an elevated blood pressure measurement. And the numbers that are important here are a systolic blood pressure of 140 and a diastolic of 90. So when these are that level or above, such a patient is deemed to have hypertension.
Now, Doc, you're mentioning these amazing, wonderful words, systolic, diastolic. I hear you. But if you could break it down, because when many people go for these blood pressure measurements, then they see one number over another number, and it confuses them. What do they actually mean? What are you measuring?
Okay, so basically your vascular tree or your blood vessels are all connected to your heart. And when the heart pumps blood, that pressure that the heart generates in those vessels, the peak pressure, that's your systolic pressure, that's the top number. And when the heart relaxes during diastole, the bottom pressure that exists within the vessels, that's your diastolic pressure. So that's a measure of how much pressure the heart is able to generate within the blood vessels. And that's determined on how hard the heart is pumping as well as the resistance in the vessels.
Now, when you look at hypertension or high blood pressure, what does it mean for our health if we do have high blood pressure?
High blood pressure is a very common condition, and it's one of the important risk factors that many patients have. And what it does, it increases your cardiovascular risk. And when I say cardiovascular risk, I'm talking about the probability of you complicating with either a stroke, a heart attack, heart failure, or peripheral vascular disease. It also accelerates atherosclerosis. That's the dirt build up within your arteries, or the muck and all the cholesterol, the fat that builds up. It also accelerates that process, it speeds it up. And so it's a significant risk factor for that. And that's what the real issue is. So if you have hypertension that's untreated, you're at risk of then having these conditions.
When you look at the different population groups, and let's look at age first, can younger children and teenagers be affected by high blood pressure?
Yes. So high blood pressure can be classified into two forms. We've got what we call is essential hypertension or primary hypertension, and then we've got secondary hypertension. Essential hypertension is what occurs generally in adults, so people as they age. So as I mentioned to you, you've got the vessels that basically maintain the pressure or contain the blood pressure that the heart generates as it pumps. So as those vessels become less compliant, so if you think of a balloon, when you blow a balloon, the balloon expands, right? And it accommodates the air. So the vessels have the same capacity or elasticity, what we call compliance in medical terms. So as you get older, the vessels get harder and stiffer. And that's what gives you essential hypertension. That's the most prevalent form. However, for younger patients, we have what we call secondary hypertension. And this is very common in younger patients, whereby they may complicate with other endocrinopathies or diseases that cause hypertension, such as pheochromocytoma, which is a tumor of the adrenal gland, or hyperaldosteronism, renal artery stenosis. So that's an important thing to consider, that if you're dealing with a young patient with hypertension, one ought to look and investigate for these secondary causes and not just assume, it's the vessels becoming less compliant.
Are there any signs and symptoms to hypertension? Because you mentioned that it is a silent condition, but surely there must be some signs or symptoms that allow someone to realize, go to your doctor and get measured right now.
Surprisingly, at the onset, especially when you have grade 1, grade 2 or early hypertension, it's completely silent. So one doesn't have manifestations of symptoms, signs and symptoms. However, patients often will present to a doctor because they've now complicated. And some of the common complications one can have is left ventricular hypertrophy, where the heart gets enlarged and they can complicate with heart failure. You can also get hypertensive retinopathy, where you suddenly have poor visual acuity. Other conditions could be renal dysfunction that you may complicate from chronic long-standing hypertension. So often patients present to doctors for other reasons, and in a majority of cases it's an incidental finding when the physician checks the blood pressure. So really the take-home message I'd say is, whenever you have a contact with a healthcare practitioner, or if you have the time, or at least annually if you haven't had, check your blood pressure.
I think it's a very important take-home message, because you want to know your numbers. And I know that's a campaign by the Hypertensive Society of South Africa, that May is about knowing your, not your phone number, but your health numbers and your blood pressure numbers, because there are millions of South Africans being affected by this condition. And when you look at it from a perspective of treatment of hypertensive conditions, is it only medication that becomes an option, or are there other treatment available?
Okay, so the management is staggered in in an approach whereby if the pressures are mildly elevated, so we said we use the cutover 140/90. So if you say, for example, you come with a pressure of 146/94, one can be advised to modify their lifestyle as an initial strategy to say change the way you live, which includes decreasing your salt intake, decreasing your carbohydrate load, exercising regularly, as well as if you have other comorbidities such as diabetes, get those better controlled, and if you can, lose weight. This is very hard for most individuals. As you know, this is something that requires one to change a lifestyle, and that's a sustained intervention that one needs to do over a long period of time in order to achieve that. So that's a strategy that we recommend for everyone. It's almost the first line. Once the numbers are high, right, or if that strategy has failed, we then recommend that patients be started on medical therapy. And again, there are certain agents that are first-line agents, second-line agents, and third-line agents, depending on whether we're achieving control or not.
Doctor, that's amazing insight, and we're going to hear more from you a bit later in dealing with the different population groups and about what more we can do to prevent hypertension. Let's take a look at the latest in health news.
In your health news, South Africa's infant mortality rate is at its lowest in almost 2 decades, having fallen by 32% between 2002 and 2017. All this improvement aligns with a sharp increase in the rate of antenatal first visit by pregnant women. These findings are featured in the 2018 South Africa survey published by the Institute of Race Relations. Researchers have studied patterns of facial coloring that are unique to every human motion they studied. According to Ohio State University, researchers who study human expressions of emotions, new forms of artificial intelligence, someday guess what you're feeling just by looking at the color of your face. We are all familiar with expressions like red in the face and pale with shock. Therefore, the color of your face can reveal your mood. The involuntary release of urine or incontinence can be caused by several factors, including the dysfunction of the bladder mechanism caused by childbirth or surgery, the injury to the pelvis, or old age. Urinary incontinence itself is not a disease, as a symptom of underlying disorder, and therefore different types of incontinence. Fortunately, most cases of incontinence can be cured and managed. Struggling to fight off infections, you could be suffering from primary immunodeficiency disease. Children and adults who fall ill with a recurrent, unusual or more severe infections may suffer from undiagnosed underlying PID. According to the Pediatric Pulmonology and the Allergy Society of South Africa, PID symptoms often go undiagnosed and underreported.
We have more after the break, including a chat with dietitian Tony on what food to avoid and more critical information from Dr. Tsabetse.